All the members to take their seats so that we can start. Meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 57 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Today, we will continue our study of the government's response to the final report of the Special Committee on Afghanistan. Today, we welcome the Honourable David Lametti, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Welcome, Minister. Thanks for appearing before the committee. He's also joined with officials from the Department of Justice. Today we have Robert Brookfield, Director General and Senior General Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section, Glenn Gilmore, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section. Welcome, everybody. Minister, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Point d'ordre, Madame la Présidente, il n'y a pas de traduction.
I'm not receiving interpretation, Madam Chair.
Traduction.
Okay, just 1 second. Madam Clerk, if you can check. Can you say one or two sentences? Okay.
C'est réglé, merci.
Okay.
The issue has been solved. Thank you.
You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we will go into round of questioning. You can please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wish to thank the members of this committee for inviting me to speak about the government response to the final report of the Special Committee on Afghanistan called Honoring Canada's Legacy in Afghanistan, Responding to the Humanitarian Crisis and Helping People Reach Safety. I would also like to thank my colleagues from the Department of Justice. My remarks, Madam Chair, will focus on the recommendations from the final report that relate to my responsibilities as the Minister of Justice, specifically those that relate to changes to the Criminal Code.
Colleague, the Minister of Public Safety, introduced Bill C-41 earlier this month to address the issues raised in this area of the report, and it has now been referred to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, and I hope all colleagues can work together to advance this important legislation expeditiously. Recommendations 10 and 11 of the final report of the Special Committee on Afghanistan called for two things. First, they called for clarity in the law, and in particular a specific exemption to the terrorism financing offence in paragraph 83.03b to allow registered Canadian organizations to deliver much-needed humanitarian assistance and other basic needs to the people of Afghanistan without facing the risk of criminal liability. Second, they called for the government to review the terrorism financing provisions in the Criminal Code and to take urgent legislative steps necessary to ensure those provisions do not unduly restrict legitimate humanitarian action that complies with international humanitarian principles and law. Après les attaques terroristes aux États
After the terrorist attacks in the United States on September 11, 2001, Canada responded to United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373 and enacted within months the Anti-Terrorism Act 2001. Among other things, this act amended the Criminal Code to create several offences designed to prevent acts of terrorism, which included 3 terrorism financing offences. Enacted rapidly to deal with the important threat from terrorism that the world was facing, these offences are broad and strict in their application.
is found in paragraph 83.03b of the Criminal Code. That offence makes it a crime to directly or indirectly collect, make available, provide, or invite someone to provide property or financial or related services, knowing it will be used by or will benefit a terrorist group. The legislation created in 2001 does not create any statutory exemptions to that offence. In contrast, the regimes of many of our allies, including the US and the United Kingdom, are more flexible and can accommodate targeted exceptions, which has allowed them to amend their regimes more quickly in response to the current reality in Afghanistan and to contribute to international aid efforts. This brings us to the situation in Afghanistan today. Before August 2021, many NGOs were working diligently to provide humanitarian assistance and other kinds of assistance to the people of Afghanistan, often with financial assistance from governments. Nous sommes conscients que tout a changé.
As we are all too aware, all that changed in 2021 when the Taliban swept into power. The government does have an authority there. For example, collecting taxes.
Taliban to be a government, it is the de facto authority in Afghanistan. D'un point de vue canadien,
For a Canadian perspective, there are good reasons to be concerned by the application of the Criminal Code to the activities of Canadian NGOs and government officials who assist them. Should they make payments knowing that some of those monies would go to the Taliban, a terrorist group, for example, by paying for salaries of Afghan employees who are subject to income tax, they could risk criminal liability under the terrorist financing offense in paragraph 8303B.
41 will create an authorization regime that would allow the Minister of Public Safety to grant an authorization to Canadian organizations to conduct activities falling within a specified purpose, such as providing humanitarian assistance or providing health care or education in Afghanistan, or providing health or other areas controlled by a terrorist group. Those who receive an authorization and respect its terms would be shielded from the risk of criminal liability when carrying out those authorized activities. A national security review would be required, and other procedural safeguards would remain in place. This change would allow Canadian humanitarian organizations to continue operating in Afghanistan and deliver desperately needed assistance while continuing to protect Canadians through robust anti-terrorist laws and close oversight. Thank you again, Madam Chair, for inviting me to speak, and I'm available to answer your questions.
Thank you, Minister. We will now proceed with our first round of questioning of 6 minutes. Mr. Janice, you can please begin. You will have 6 minutes for your round of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. Minister, under C-41, how long do you expect it to take to approve an application from an organization?
Well, thank you for that question. It's probably a question better addressed to the Minister of Public Safety when he's in front of you, I believe, in the very near future. But I know from having heard him present the bill, both in the House of Commons and at a press conference, that he would like to move expeditiously in order to allow humanitarian groups who are working in Afghanistan to move as quickly as they possibly can.
Yeah, sorry, but it wasn't so much about expeditious isn't a timeline, and I know the minister hasn't. No representative of your government has said this publicly, and these timelines are very important for these organizations. As you alluded to, we're far behind our allies. The Afghanistan Committee made all-party recommendations in June of last year. The Foreign Affairs Committee adopted a motion calling for action in the fall, and we're already at the end of March here. But the question isn't so much about the timeline for passing the legislation. It's once the legislation passes, how long will it take to turn around applications from organizations? We certainly don't want to lose another winter of not being able to have Canadian organizations involved in the humanitarian response.
Again, that's a fair question, Mr. Janice, certainly a fair question, but it is a question better addressed to the Minister of Public Safety. Again, my understanding is that his intention will be to move as expeditiously as possible with those applications once the law is passed.
Could you or your colleagues work to follow up in writing with the committee, either directly from your department or from Public Safety, with what the estimated or the desired timelines would be for approving applications?
Again, it falls within his responsibilities. I will allow him to make the engagement and the undertaking.
How broad will the applications be from organizations able to be? So I'm thinking if an organization is making an application to provide assistance, will it have to be for a limited period of time, or will they have kind of a permanent until revoked authorization to run similar kinds of projects? Will the same authorization potentially apply to multiple organizations working together or on similar projects, or will they be narrowly constrained in terms of organization and amount of time?
Thank you for the question. The point of the law is to allow a sufficient degree of flexibility for humanitarian agencies working on the ground while still protecting our ability to combat terrorism and terrorist financing. So it's critical that we strike a balance. So the law is meant to strike a balance. My understanding is that humanitarian groups will apply to the minister, and so, again, probably best a question left to the Minister of Public Safety in terms of how he's going to exercise his discretion. But my understanding of the law is that it is flexible, and it will allow for the Minister of Public Safety to make those determinations. In the likely course of events, it will be humanitarian organizations applying with a description of the activities that they want to undertake, and then the exemption will be tailored according to that application.
Okay, so just from the perspective of the criminal code amendments, what you're saying is that the powers that are given to the minister are extremely broad in terms of whether the minister is going to use that discretion to apply broader exemptions without time limits or narrower exceptions with time limits. It's essentially entirely a matter of the discretion of the minister.
That's certainly my understanding.
Okay.
Rob, do you want to add to that?
Sure. So the legislation as drafted, if it gets passed, in 83.031 is to carry out in a specified geographic areas controlled by a terrorist group a specified activity that would be otherwise prohibited. So that's the power to the Minister of Public Safety. There are timelines on that, but his discretion is fairly unbound in that sense.
Sorry, are there limits to the time he can set it for?
There's a requirement to reapply is after 5 years?
5 years, okay.
Yes, you can renew the initial time frame for each authorization.
Okay,
is a maximum of 5
thank you.
years, but it can be renewed.
Okay, yeah, so just in the time I have left, why not have legislation that generally says that organizations who are having the appropriate level of oversight are engaged in humanitarian activities that are in particular ways minimizing any payments that go to local authorities? Why not provide that description, that exception on a more general basis, rather than simply having a piece of legislation that empowers the minister to do whatever he or she wants in terms of granting or not granting, giving it to some organizations or not, and that is potentially very, very costly and labor intensive on the part of organizations as well as government? Why not do what our allies have done and provide a more general humanitarian exemption?
Well, again, it's particular to Canada, the way in which we have very tough anti-terrorist financing laws embedded in the criminal code.
But just to jump in on that, wouldn't the Americans and the British say they have tough laws as well?
Allow the minister to answer the question.
We do still have the fight against terrorist financing, which is important, and so we have to balance between the two, and so we are giving a sufficient degree of flexibility to humanitarian organizations who are very happy with the bill, by the way.
Yeah. But
but still allow us to fight terrorism. Why, if you go in the direction that you have recommended, Mr. Janis, you open the possibility that somebody could try to work around.
But do you think the American and the British rules are inadequate?
I think we have chosen the best set of rules that apply to the Canadian
structure. The implication is that the American and the British aren't serious or don't have serious effective regimes on this. I think
no, not at all. It's just they have different structures with much more discretion on the part of their elected officials to act. So their discretion is elsewhere. The Attorney General in the United States is an investigating Attorney General, which I am not. So it's a very different set of systems, and we've tailored the best set for ours.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting. The time is up for Mr. Janis. We will now proceed to Ms. Kayabaga. Ms. Kayabaga, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also would like to start my questions by thanking the Minister for taking the time to appear to this committee and answering these very important questions for a lot of people here in our communities. So I'll start my questions. As Canadians, I think we do take pride in our history of helping other countries and countries that are in most vulnerable situations. And we have a longstanding commitment that we've had as a government towards Afghanistan. And I think that the work that you've done and we've done reflects our values as Canadians. But I think that we have to continue to provide pathways to provide humanitarian aid in ways that don't violate our strong anti-terrorism laws. So if you could just comment on what criminal laws apply in Canada with respect to this financing terrorism.
Thanks very much. As I mentioned in a more cryptic fashion in my opening presentation, there are several financing of terrorism offenses in the criminal code, providing, collecting of property, intending or knowing, so willful recklessness, knowing that it will be used to carry out a terrorist activity, collecting, providing, or making available property, intending or knowing that it will be used by a terrorist activity or terrorist group. So those are the intentional offenses. Using property for the purpose of carrying out a terrorist activity or possessing property intending that it be used. Aiding and abetting all of the above are also offenses under the criminal code. And these offenses apply to Canadians outside of Canada, but also to persons who are not necessarily Canadian citizens, but ordinarily resident in Canada. So all of these are listed in the criminal code. We have created the ability to create exemptions, given that power to the Minister of Public Safety, in order to allow humanitarian aid and assistance to happen.
And we've heard a lot of misinformation that people would like to put out there and confuse Canadians on what we're actually doing. Could you tell us why the humanitarian aid regime in Canada is embedded within the criminal code?
Well, that was a decision, as I mentioned cryptically in my opening remarks, a decision made in the wake of 9/11 to have very strong terrorist financing provisions in the criminal code in order to get at them, in order to get at the kinds of activities, direct and indirect, that were used to finance terrorist activity. They were, they were in the moment. They were done. They were done for the right reasons. They were a strong set of provisions, but they were done quickly. And we now have a different situation in which we have what was previously a terrorist sect in Afghanistan becoming the de facto regime in Afghanistan. We'd already declared them a terrorist entity under the criminal code. They become a de facto regime. We expose, therefore, a number of humanitarian groups to risk of prosecution under the criminal code, given the definitions we came up with in 2001. So this is a way to balance in a safe and secure way those interests and give them certainty that they won't be prosecuted for what they're doing.
Again, for the sake of the misinformation that's out there right now, could you also comment on whether or not this would undermine our ability to combat terrorism in Canada?
No, it shouldn't, because it's the baseline provision is still a criminal code provision. What we carve out is an exceptional regime. A humanitarian group will apply to the minister, detail the kinds of activities that they are undertaking or would like to undertake, and then the minister will be able to grant an exemption. But for other groups, other activities, those criminal code provisions will still apply.
Understand? Okay. Well, I still have time, so maybe you can share some insight on what the process would look like and how closely will the departments and agencies be working together to move fast on this?
Probably a question best addressed to the Minister of Public Safety when you see him in short order. Again, from what I've seen him say at the introductory press conference, he would like to work closely with the agencies. He's already inviting them to start thinking about what they would like to do and apply for. And my sense is that he will work closely and expeditiously with each agency as they apply.
And could you speak on how this proposed framework minimizes the risk of benefits accruing to the Taliban or other terrorist entities as well?
Well, it's certainly, by asking agencies to think through their activities, it certainly, I suppose, predicts the kinds of expenses or the kinds of activities as well as the kinds of expenses that they are going to undertake in Afghanistan. That allows us to tailor what we're doing. Again, we want first and foremost for these groups to be able to undertake humanitarian activities in a safe and secure way in Afghanistan. If there is some incidental tax payments or other things that might go to the regime, that may be something the minister will take into account and allow for it to happen. But as I had stated, the original criminal code provisions remain in place for everything else, and so it helps us to keep an eye on the larger picture of terrorist financing at the same time.
Thank you. We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desaep for 6 minutes. Mr. Brunel Desaep, you can please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for being with us. I understood that you wanted to come to our committee today, and I thank you for it. February 7th, 2022, I asked a first question on the issue of our Canadian NGOs and that they were not able to do their work in Afghanistan because of the criminal code. I asked that at the Afghanistan committee, and then I tabled a motion so that our NGOs are able to do their activities, and I heard that your cabinet blocked it. After that, many ministers came and NGOs came to the committee. The problem has been known for a while. Why did it take so long to arrive with the tabling of this bill, Mr. Minister? Answer. It was tabled by the Minister of Public Safety, but it's the criminal code. I know, but there are amendments to the criminal code that fall under public safety. Yes, I am responsible for the criminal code, but there are certain issues that fall under the purview of a different department. And I cannot, of course, talk about information covered by cabinet secret, or cabinet confidence rather. But why did it take so long? I'm not asking you to share these things. It's complex. Okay, that's the answer that I was expecting. When the pandemic hit, Mr. Minister, in March 2020, we were able to create programs like the CIRB and other programs that were necessary. Do you believe that these programs were not complex to implement? Yes, they were, but we were able to do it in a few weeks. I was a part of the discussions to implement them. Me too. So a Canadian that loses their job, is that more important than an Afghan child who is dying because the situation is an emergency? That's not a comparison that we can make. We need to examine the situation where things are changing rapidly in Afghanistan. There are concerns, of course, not only for institutions and organizations and what they're doing, but we also have legislation, the anti-terrorist legislation, and we also have a system, we have a police system that is unique in Canada, so it's not easy. Question, so we can do it when a pandemic hits, but we can't do it when children are dying, even though we are responsible for them because we participated in the intervention in Afghanistan. That's not what I'm saying. Well, you took a long time knowing that the situation was serious. Now you talked about 1373 from 2002 from the United Nations, and you said that it took a few months for the government to implement legislation to change the criminal code because of Resolution 1373. And then there was 2615 that was tabled by the United Nations regarding funding for terrorist groups and for NGOs to do their work. So why in 2002 did it only take a few months to adapt to a UN resolution, and in 2001 that it took 18 months? Well, I would like to start by saying that I wasn't here in 2001. So it was possible to do it in 2001, but not now. We've just tabled a bill that meets the resolution. So it was easier to go more quickly in 2002 than in 2022. That's not what I said. You're putting words in my mouth. Apologies. That's certainly not what I wanted to do. Did you consult NGOs that have operations where C-41 would be applied? That would be the work of Minister Mendicino, and to my knowledge, he did. Because I saw his press conference with NGOs. But I think there was a big humanitarian organization that was not communicated with. They shared recommendations. I have a question. Why is the government ratifying Geneva Conventions, and why did they not propose a general exemption that excludes activities, humanitarian activities, that would apply to that section of the criminal code and not only 83.3 as submitted in the special committee and as asked for by many NGOs? As I stated, in Canada, we have a system. We have investigations and prosecutions that are done independently from the government. That's what Rob had done as a minister, and I support what he had done as minister. We need to work within this system. It's not the same system as the United States or the UK. We chose a system that would protect organizations like Doctors Without Borders without forgetting our other obligations. Why had you not proposed the adoption of something else? That is something that should be asked to Minister Joly. Thank you. Noted.
Thank you. Just to remind before we go to the Ms. Kwan, like all the questions should be directed through the chair, and please, one person at a time. If a question is being asked, opportunity should be provided to the witness to answer the question. So we will now proceed to Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister, and the officials for being here today. I think we've been waiting for a long time to engage with you, so we very much appreciate this. The NDP, of course, through my colleague, Heather McPherson, who's the Foreign Affairs critic, and then also my colleague, Alistair McGregor, who is the public safety critic, has written to the government on this issue back in December of 2021. Subsequently, a follow-up letter was written in February to various ministers asking why action couldn't be taken. And this was especially in light of the testimony that was presented to the Special Committee on Afghanistan from NGOs who were unable to provide aid on the ground to people who are in desperate need. In fact, World Vision indicated, as did a number of other NGOs who came, basically indicated that because of these anti-terrorism laws, children were dying of malnutrition. They had packets ready to go that were ready to be delivered on the ground to save lives, were unable to do so. So I'm really struggling as to understand why it's really taken basically 2 years for Canada to get to this stage where this criminal code change is finally before us for deliberation.
Thank you for the question. Look, I understand the frustration. I understand the frustration, and certainly the challenge that was in front of us in Afghanistan, and it was a rather unique situation, again, of a terrorist sect that then becomes a de facto government and authority. My role in all this is to act and to look at the legal context. And I think we have now in this law a piece of legislation that amends the criminal code that works within the Canadian context, that protects these organizations and their work on the ground, their very good work on the ground, while respecting the various structures of investigation, prosecution in Canada, and ensuring that they won't be prosecuted. This, in my view, is the best way forward, and it is in response to a very complex situation.
Yeah, I guess, though, Minister, it doesn't answer the question why it took so long. In the Afghanistan committee, we had different ministers who came forward, and each of us, across party lines, to be honest with you, asked the various different ministers, and each of them passed the buck and said it was someone else's responsibility. Ultimately, they pin it, I think, on you. As the Justice Minister, in terms of the law that needs to be dealt with respect to the criminal code. So it's taken 2 years for us to get here. So now, you know, I guess it's suppose water under the bridge, so to speak, accepting that lives, I think, were lost because Canada took so long. Other jurisdictions managed to do a carve-out without this long, arduous process that we have to engage in. So now we have this legislation before us, and there's still problems. Doctors Without Borders wrote and indicated that they're deeply concerned with the legislation. In fact, they're saying that they can't support it, and they're saying that it's incompatible incompatible with the level of flexibility and urgency required for delivering emergency humanitarian response. And they indicated that, this legislation does not provide for a humanitarian exemption in the criminal code to remove any risk that their staff or their organization could be charged with a criminal offense for delivering medical care to a patient in a place where Canadian anti-terror laws apply. So I guess I would love to hear your response to that. Why could we not have brought in legislation to ensure that humanitarian exemption is being applied?
Well, first of all, I disagree with the characterization of Doctors Without Borders. The law, as proposed, provides an extremely large degree of flexibility to the Minister of Public Safety to grant a humanitarian exemption, including for the kind of work that Doctors Without Borders provides on the ground. And so I disagree quite strongly with their interpretation. I think this law is adequate to do that, and I think it does, in fact, allow them an exemption from prosecution. The Canadian system, and again, I'm not going to pass the buck in the sense that I'm not going to talk about things that are discussed in Cabinet. That's a matter of Cabinet confidence. But the Canadian legal system is such that there's independent prosecutions undertaken by various crowns across Canada, federal, provincial. There's independent investigations undertaken by police authorities. And they are independent of me, and they're independent of the government. And there's no way that as a government, and I'm the Attorney General in that government, there's no way I can tell a prosecutor to prosecute or not prosecute. That is a power that other countries have, like the United States, for example. So they can carve it out. But we can't carve it out in the same way. We needed a piece of legislation. We now have a piece of legislation, and we have, I think, a good piece of legislation.
Yeah, okay. It's still interesting note that other countries were able to find carve-outs and we couldn't, and we lost 2 years in that process. Urgent need for people who are dying. Now, on the question around the legislation, what Doctors Without Borders is saying that they would have to apply for a provision to do this work. What if they say no? Should they then not provide a medical care?
The Minister of Public Safety has undertaken, and again, it's a question that you can ask him, he's undertaken to look at these applications expeditiously. We understand the needs that
Sorry
have
for
arisen.
interrupting, Minister. Time is up for Ms. Kwan. You'll get an opportunity in the second round to answer her question. We will now proceed to Mr. McGuire for 5 minutes. Mr. McGuire, you can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just wanted to add a few things to some of your comments that have already been said. Mr. Minister, thank you for being here, by the way, but Canadian humanitarian agencies have been calling for that legislation for quite some time, and I'm deeply troubled that it took your government this long to introduce C-41. There's millions of Afghans who are in desperate need of food and other supplies, critical supplies. Time is still of the essence. You must have known of the dire straits that Afghan women and children are currently in. And in light of the fact, and this has been asked a bit before, but in light of the fact that, as you say, the minister is going to be here shortly, we're not aware that he's going to be here at least till the end of April. So I'm going to ask you again, do you think, what's your excuse for taking so long to table a relatively straightforward piece of legislation? Don't you talk to the ministers?
Well, again, I'm not at liberty to disclose the kinds of things that one discusses around the cabinet table. That's a matter of cabinet confidence. I think the legal conclusion that's evident in this piece of legislation is that a specific law was needed given the structures that are present in the Canadian system. And as I said, they were brought in by Rob Nicholson, prosecutorial independence. I think they're a good thing. But that means I can't tell prosecutors when to exercise and how to exercise their discretion.
Oh, but what took so long to bring the legislation in?
And so we had to resort to a piece of legislation. The Minister of Public Safety has committed to moving expeditiously once this legislation is passed, and I hope that you will pass this legislation quickly.
But it's been years. So when drafting this legislation, your government would have reviewed what other countries are doing to ensure their humanitarian agencies can deliver aid. And it's been discussed earlier, they did. What other allied country has created a process for humanitarian groups to apply for government approval before delivering the assistance to Afghanistan? It's like, have you not talked to other countries to find out what kind of cooperation could take place there as well?
Well, our officials have been looking at what happens in other countries, but again, and I'll ask them to supplement my answer in a moment, but what I will say is in the Canadian system, with independent criminal investigations, with independent prosecutions, we needed something that didn't rely on, a simple carve-out, because I can't direct prosecutors to prosecute or not, and I can't direct the police to investigate or not. And
well,
if there is a question of interpretation, it will be incumbent on those authorities to exercise that discretion.
A little different twist than a question that's already been asked from the Doctors Without Borders. Joseph Bellevue, their executive director of the Doctors Without Borders, stated that Bill C-41 is, and I quote, unduly restrictive, and it should be replaced with a general humanitarian exemption. So I guess I'm wondering, there was a decision made by your government, and I'm wondering why they decided to amend the criminal code rather than to grant a humanitarian exemption.
Well, granting a humanitarian exemption is still an amendment to the criminal code, first of all. Secondly, the fight against terrorism is still important. Quite frankly, if we had done that, certain parliamentarians would probably be angry for us saying we've become soft on terrorism. We can't have that happen either. It is still important that we track terrorist activities, including a government like the Taliban, including other groups around the world. And so this piece of legislation affects a very important balance. The fight against terrorism is still important, but the fight to provide humanitarian aid on the ground is also important, and we have carved out a pretty good exemption between the two using the criminal code.
We in Canadians certainly know that, Mr. Minister, and you've certainly been soft in trying to help the folks in Afghanistan that helped our troops get back here in that area as well. But it's important to note the process for humanitarian agencies to seek this application to provide aid in Afghanistan is not contained within this legislation and will be determined later through regulations. I know you had a discussion with this with my colleague who was here just a few moments ago, but this undoubtedly will result in more delays. So can you confirm that the work being done on drafting these regulations and you are that work is being done on drafting those regulations, and that you are actively consulting with humanitarian agencies to ensure that the process is efficient and straightforward as it possibly can be. And so, therefore, when will these regulations be available?
I would ask Rob Brookfield to add in.
To clarify, the bill does provide for the possibility of regulations, but the power of the Minister of Public Safety to issue authorizations is not restricted to the existence of regulations. So the Minister of Public Safety would have discretion to use that power without the need for regulations in the first place.
We will now proceed to Ms. Lalonde. Ms. Lalonde, you will have 5 minutes. You can please begin.
Merci. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for being with us at our committee today. I had the privilege to be with you during the announcement for C-41. The announcement was well received from people who were there, and it showed that the government saw the importance of working together, because it's not only your department that has to work here, as you mentioned. There was collaboration between many departments in order to develop C-41.
That, I know we like to talk here about, what's not, but let's not forget that there is close to 30,000 Afghan here currently in Canada, our commitment of the 40,000. And Minister, I know that the Minister of International Development during that particular conference did make reference that since August of 2021, we are still providing humanitarian assistance in many forms through various organizations such as the United Nations and the International Committee on the Red Cross. So from that perspective, there may be individuals that could say that the law already did allow for humanitarian aid to be provided. Can you maybe share some thoughts about that and why the importance of C-41 was brought in?
Est-ce que je devrais répondre en français?
Should I respond in French or in English? In the language of your choice. Thank you for the question. It's false to say that we haven't done anything for Afghanistan. We have 30,000 refugees here, and we are working with our allies in the field and with organizations in order to help people immigrate or offer other forms of assistance.
In a system where I can't dictate prosecutorial decisions and I can't dictate investigations, when to investigate or not, the only secure way to create an exemption for humanitarian aid on the ground, to the extent that it might touch on anti-terrorist financing, is to do what we've done here. There were a number of people advancing interpretations that said, well, you don't even need to do this, it could be done. That would rely on the discretion of individuals that the government has no control over. And then at the end of the day, if it happens that one prosecutor decides to go ahead, or someone decides to investigate, one prosecutor decides to go ahead, then they get angry with the government and say, well, why did you let this happen? Well, it's independent. So this is the way in the Canadian structure of investigations that we could do it. We have done it. I'm proud of the bill, and I think it will have a major impact on the ground.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your answer. I represent the community of Orleans that has strong ties with Afghanistan at the community level and with Army staff, people who helped in Afghanistan.
I wanted to ask, and you sort of alluded to this because, it's interesting how this conversation's happening here because we're saying tough on crime, not tough on crime, mais il y a quand même un désir.
But there's still a desire to act, but within certain parameters, if I can say it that way. Perhaps I can ask you,
Minister, could changing the Canadian law here undermine our ability to combat terrorism? And I think that's very important and relevant in the context of the global situation.
No, I don't think it does, because the anti-terrorism laws, or anti-terrorist financing laws more particularly, remain in place. They remain the baseline, and it is only through the exceptional regime, so the application to the minister and the ministerial exemption, that there's an exemption. And that's critically important. You could easily see a situation, sadly, I have to say, where a group, if we had gone with a larger basic exemption for all humanitarian work, where somebody under the guise of humanitarian work tries to circumvent the law and the anti-terrorism financing laws. That's a very real possibility, and so we haven't chosen that route, and I'm glad that we didn't. I think we will get the same positive impact for all of the same groups that are legitimately working on the ground in Afghanistan this way, without weakening the anti-terrorist financing laws.
Sorry for interrupting, Minister. Time is up for Ms. Lalonde. We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Dessep for 2.5 minutes. You can please begin, Mr. Brunel Dessep.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Minister, you said that C-41 is a solution, and the Bloc will support you and will try to help it move along and perhaps have informal amendments so that it can be moved quickly through committee if all parties are in agreement. But you seem surprised that we're asking a question with regards to how long it has taken. You're saying that you can't tell us what happens behind closed doors because of cabinet confidence, but this solution has existed since the beginning because nothing has changed since the problem was highlighted. When we ask you why it took so long, you said it's because you were having discussions, so it's your discussions that took too long to find a solution. Earlier, you talked about Resolution 1373. You're the one who mentioned it. You stated that after 1373, the Liberal government at the time had acted very quickly. So why, if they succeeded in 2002, I just don't understand. The solution's been there since the beginning, but it's your discussions that took too long. So were the ministers in 2002 a lot more competent than the current ministers? I understand that it's a funny question. It's not funny. We take our responsibility seriously. We examined the situation and we proposed a solution that would work within the Canadian infrastructure. And I'm proud of it. And I'm happy to know that you'll support it. We're never against amendments that are made in good faith. But I would leave that to the Department of Public Safety, but I think we're going in the right direction, and I would like to thank you for your support. No problem. I've had this position since the beginning, but you still haven't answered my question. If the solution has existed since the beginning, why did it take you 18 months? Answer. I'm not going to repeat conversations, so it's your conversations that took so long. You're putting words in my mouth. Well, that's because you're not saying anything. But I can't respond. You're not saying anything. I can't because of parliamentary principles.
We will now proceed to Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes. Ms. Kwan, you can please begin.
Thank you. I just want to point out one glaring piece. I know that Canada, of course, provided humanitarian aid through international organizations. What we're talking about, of course, is the barrier for Canadian organizations, and that's why this is needed. So please don't conflate the two aspects, because I think it does a disservice to the Canadian organizations who are trying their very best to do this important humanitarian work. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's why we're here.
Precisely,
Yeah.
but I think that to suggest that, but we're already doing A, so, why this anxiety?
No, I didn't. Excuse me. No, I think you're misinterpreting what I said.
Sorry, I wasn't. Sorry, Minister.
If you don't mind.
No, if you don't
Sorry
mind.
for
if I
interrupting,
may
please,
finish.
one person at a time.
If I may finish with my time, Minister, both, I think, the parliamentary secretary for the Ministry of Immigration made that comment and infer that. And then you replied to that question. I just don't think that's helpful, because why we're here today, we're talking about Canadian humanitarian groups who's been blocked to provide aid. And I think it's unfortunate to go down that road in this sort of strange defense of inaction. What I would like to ask, Minister, on this question is this. Does this legislation apply to Canadian citizens working for non-Canadian organizations, such as the UN agencies or other organizations?
I'm going to respond first to that comment because I think you've misinterpreted. Sadly, you misinterpreted, and in good faith, I would imagine, what I had said. What I had said in response to my colleague was that we were doing what we could to help Afghan people through other international organizations. It wasn't meant to replace what could be done to help Canadian organizations. It was doing what we could do at the time in the face of a humanitarian crisis. We did that, and that's all I meant. I have worked in good faith to try to bring forth this current piece of legislation, and I will continue to do that, again, to help Canadians. With respect to Canadians who might be working for other international organizations, my understanding is they would already be covered if by the country of that exemption. But I would ask Robert or Glenn to add to that.
Time is up for Ms. Kwan. We will now proceed to Mr. Redekop.
Sorry, Madam Chair, could I just have a point of order? I noted, though, that with other members, such as from the Conservative, Mr. Genius, such as from Mr. Lon, who asked the question of the minister. You gave him extra time to finish the question that they asked, but somehow when it comes to me, that never happened twice. It didn't happen today.
No, Ms. Kwan, that's not the case. I
is
am
the
just
case.
trying to be fair with everyone and everyone having the time. So I am just allowing everyone to have their time. That's what
sorry,
I'm
Madam
working
Chair.
on. So we will now proceed to Mr. Reddy-Kopp.
Point of order. Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Brunel.
Pourquoi je parle en anglais?
Why am I speaking in English? I'm upset. I agree with my colleague Jenny. Sometimes the minister was able to answer Mr. Garnett and Ms. Lalonde. I think that Jenny should have that same possibility, that the minister should answer the question.
But like if you go into Blues, you will see Ms. Kwan has at many times got extra time. Right now, we have to start a second panel. We are like tight on time. I will go to Mr. Reddy-Kopp for 5 minutes, and then we will end the panel with Mr. Dhaliwal for 5 minutes. Then we have the second panel. So, Mr. Reddy-Kopp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as long as she's quick, I will let Jenny ask her question real quick and get an answer from the minister.
Well, thank you very much to that courtesy. Question's been asked, just waiting for an answer.
So the answer is most likely through, as the minister said, through their own mechanisms for international organizations, they would be covered. But if a Canadian citizen abroad, wherever they're working for, wish to apply, they would be able to apply. The legislation applies to Canadian persons and organizations.
Thank you. Madam Chair, from what I understand, the Attorney General is the chief law officer of the Crown, which means he represents the Crown and not individual departments or agencies of the government, and therefore seeks to protect the interests of the whole government. And for the Attorney General, I want to better understand how delegations of authorities work in the departments. And for those who might be listening, delegation of authority is an official process that defines exactly who has the authority to make certain decisions, such as committing to spending money or issuing citizenship, that sort of thing. And generally, a minister, from what I understand, delegates authority down to their deputy minister, who in turn might delegate it down further to another senior staff. So, Minister, is it the practice of this government for a minister in one department to delegate authority to a political staff member in another department?
The Attorney General's role is different. I act as the Chief Law Officer, so in this capacity, I will give legal opinions to the government, although I also can give legal opinions to the government as Minister of Justice. And I have a number of lawyers who work in that capacity as Attorney General. I am the named person on every piece of litigation with the government and against the government. So in that capacity, we will make litigation decisions. I will make litigation decisions, or those lawyers who are working in that line of authority will make litigation decisions. And we work collaboratively, but I guess technically I'm responsible for all of them as Attorney General.
So do you not know how the delegation of authority works in the government then?
I do know how the delegation of authority works in the government. That's what you asked me in my role as Attorney General.
Okay, so, well, then can you comment on if it's normal in this government for a minister in one department to delegate their authority to a political staff member in another department?
I'm not going to answer a hypothetical question. What I can say is that there are lawyers from the Department of Justice who are embedded in a number of different departments across government, a number of different ministries, a number of different departments across government. They are still technically under my govern, if you will, but they still respond to particular ministers in that regard.
Let's try this a slightly different way. Is there a mechanism within Canadian law to extend ministerial delegations of authority to people such as members of Parliament or senators?
It depends on what you're doing. If you're asking me as Attorney General if I can delegate the authority to prosecute, we've already hived that off as an independent prosecution service in Canada. We have also hived off the ability to have to undertake criminal investigations. We've given that power to the police. So in terms of my portfolio, these things have already been done, and as I said, they were done by a Conservative government. I'm very strongly in favor of them having been done. I think we have a better system because of it, because we have a much more neutral and much less political system because of it.
So I guess what I'm getting at here is the situation with Senator McFedrin, where the Minister of Immigration and the Minister of National Defense were, the authority of those departments was supposedly, allegedly used by Senator McFedrin. And what I'm trying to find out is if there's any mechanism in the government for that delegation of authority to somehow end up in a senator's hands.
I had nothing to do with those with that situation, and I'm not going to.
Yeah, I'm not accusing you of anything, and that's why I'm asking the more general question: is it possible, from your knowledge of the law and how it works in the government, is it possible for that delegation of authority, for that authority to be delegated in such a way, from one department to another?
Again, the Global Affairs Canada, I know, was issuing certain documents in order to help people get out of Afghanistan. My understanding is that that there were other false documents that were also circulating.
And is it possible for the senator to have had authorization from any department to do anything that would be in the delegation of authority?
Again, I wasn't party or privy to any of those conversations.
How much time?
5 seconds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will end this panel with Mr. Dhaliwal for 5 minutes. Mr. Dhaliwal, you can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I would love to thank the Honourable Minister for appearing before the committee. It's always been an honour to work with him, his role as a minister and his role as a parliamentary secretary before that. Madam Chair, you know that the Special Committee on Afghanistan has done great work, where members from all different stripes, came together and put those recommendations, and those recommendations are being put in place. But I have some questions before I give Minister a blanket time to respond to any of the issues that he wanted to say, and he was cut off during other remarks. Those questions are, number one, to the Minister, how is this legislation better than the status quo? That is what I would like to see Canadians listen to him.
Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal, for that question. Again, pleasure to work with you as well, although our time way back in international trade ages both of us, although probably me more than you. The status quo creates uncertainty. It creates risk, legal risk for Canadian humanitarian organizations working on the ground in Afghanistan, because it would rely on the discretion of both police investigators and prosecutors to not prosecute them under the fairly clear terms of the Canadian Criminal Code. And so, while one would hope, I suppose, in an ideal world, that discretion would be exercised in a way that benefits Canadian humanitarian organizations, one can't guarantee it. And the organizations were looking for certainty because they want to be able to say to their workers, they want to be able, the people that are collaborating with them, the people that are working for them on the ground, that they will be protected from being prosecuted under the Canadian anti-terrorist financing regime. And so what this law does is it gives certainty. How? By allowing an organization to apply to the Minister of Public Safety for an exemption from the provisions of the criminal code. That happens, and hopefully it will be done. Hopefully the law will be passed quickly. Hopefully the organizations are probably preparing already their applications to the Minister of Public Safety, and then immediately they'll be able to get that approval and exemption, and they'll be able to do the good work that they do on the ground without fear of prosecution in Canada.
Minister, you have earlier mentioned about dealing with the terrorism. When it comes to this legislation, could changing Canadian law here undermine our ability to combat terrorism?
No, as I mentioned to Madame Lalonde, it is, I think, by maintaining the anti-terrorist financing legislation as the baseline, it prevents, frankly, the abuse of the potential of abuse of a larger carve-out for all humanitarian work, because it allows the organization in question to apply, and it allows the minister to look at the work that it's proposed to be done on the ground, all the while keeping the anti-terrorist financing legislation in place so that that can be appropriately monitored.
Thank you. And Minister, there are many instances you were cut off when you wanted to pass remarks. Would you like to take the minute and a half that I have left to address anything that you want to say that you haven't addressed?
Corrected by the chair. Thank you. Look, it is a good piece of legislation. It is a compromise that respects the structure of Canadian investigations, prosecutions, and Canadian Criminal Code. It allows us to allow that humanitarian work to take place, and it allows those anti-terrorism financing laws to remain the baseline. So I hope that this committee will support the passage of this legislation. I hope all parties will support the passage of this legislation, such that we can allow those good organizations to do their work as soon as possible.
Thank you, Minister, for being here and all the great work that you do. Continue to do that. Very best to you, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal. With that, this panel comes to an end, and on behalf of all the members of this committee, I really want to thank you, Minister, for appearing and taking out the time, and thank you to the officials also. With that, the meeting is suspended for a few minutes so that we allow the next panel to take their seats. For this panel, we are joined by Honorable Anita Anand, Minister of National Defense. Thank you, Minister, for joining this committee. We are also joined by the officials from the Department of National Defense. We have Mr. Bill Matthews, Deputy Minister, General Wayne D. Eyre, Chief of the Defense Staff, Canadian Armed Forces, and also we are joined by Major General Paul Prevost, Director of Staff, Strategic Joint Staff. Minister, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we will go to our round of questioning. So welcome to this committee. You can please begin.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to appear today to update you on the Department of National Defense's response to the final report of the Special Committee on Afghanistan. Under Operation Aegis, the Canadian Armed Forces responded swiftly to support federal efforts to evacuate Canadian citizens and Afghans eligible for resettlement, providing strategic airlift capabilities to help bring them to safety. In the final report, National Defense is implicated in recommendations 1, 2, and 18. Today, I will discuss the actions that we have taken to respond to each. First of all, recommendation 1 calls for the government to re-examine our lessons learned from our missions in Afghanistan and apply those in future planning and response. The Canadian Armed Forces conducted a number of exercises at all levels after Operation Aegis ended to identify areas for improvement in relevant policies, programs, and operations. As a result, our coordination mechanisms have grown stronger, and we have built on the success of our strategic airlift operations in Afghanistan, as well as in cooperation with allies and with partners that was so critical to that success. Nous le constatons dans le travail qui...
We can see it in the work that continues today in Ukraine, as Canadian Armed Forces are offering tactical air support of goods.
Royal Canadian Air Force to Prestwick, Scotland, a hub from which our aviators have transported over £7 million of Ukraine-bound military aid. The second recommendation calls for the federal government to establish a structure for interdepartmental coordination to respond to future crises, with Global Affairs Canada as the lead. Now, National Defense participates in the interdepartmental task force that brings together departments from across government implicated in a given crisis to enable a timely and an effective and comprehensive whole of government response. And we have seen time and time again that during international crises, the Canadian Armed Forces rise to the challenge and provide critical capabilities for the government and the country. And I thank them from the bottom of my heart. Mais nous savons que...
But we know these are just one part of the broader toolkit to address complex global issues.
Complex. And we will continue working closely with Global Affairs Canada and collaborating with our other government partners to respond to emergencies at home and abroad. Finally, Recommendation 18 calls for Global Affairs to assemble a whole-of-government team to help bring Afghans to safety. Since the outset of the crisis in Afghanistan, National Defense has worked closely with other government departments to bring as many Afghans as possible to safety. We continue to support IRCC with their goal of resettling 40,000 Afghans by 2024. Ce soutien inclut la validation.
This includes validating applications in support of IRCC's new policy to help reunite former language and cultural advisors with members of their extended family outside Canada.
In conclusion, Canadian Armed Forces members have shared their stories about what Operation Aegis meant to them. Corporal Mackenzie Birch recalls evacuating a child on the second-to-last flight out of Kabul in August. The child, carried by his mother, was exhausted and drained of emotion. Many months later, Corporal Birch saw that child once again this time on a flight from Toronto to Vancouver. The young boy was one of many Afghan refugees on the plane who was headed to Vancouver to build a new life. Le Caporal Birch était...
Corporal Birch felt so much optimism seeing that child who months earlier could barely manage a smile but was now happy and full of hope for a better, brighter future.
And Corporal Birch realized that he had become part of the story of Operation Aegis, part of the effort and sacrifice of thousands of Canadians and Afghans over the past 20 years. The CANSOFCOM members helping the vulnerable and the elderly, the aircraft officers working tirelessly to help the scared passengers, the medical team tending to those who needed it most. That is the story of Operation Aegis. The connection is what drives us to keep working hard every day to advance peace and prosperity around the world. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will now begin our round of questioning, and we will begin our first round with Ms. Rempel-Garner for 6 minutes. Ms. Rempel-Garner, you can please begin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. Just for context for my questions, my husband is a American combat veteran, and he served in Afghanistan. So it was something to watch his reaction to the fall of Afghanistan from my campaign office, while many of my constituents were pouring in with requests for evacuation while the government was in caretaker mode. That's something I'd just like to get you on the record that that is not something that our country should be, that's not a situation our country should be placed in again.
Well, first of all, I thank you for telling me this very personal and emotional part of what you were experiencing in 2021. And certainly I knew that your spouse served, but I didn't really know many details. So thank you for sharing that with me, and I thank him for continuing to step up. I think it's a global service that people are actually doing.
Going forward, though, has anything been put in place that if we do have another duty to evacuate a country, that that would be advice given to the PMO or to perhaps when they were considering triggering an election? Like, in terms of recommendation 8, has there been any formal advice that perhaps wasn't a great idea to go to an election knowing that the country was about to fall to the Taliban?
Well, so I can only say that it was an extremely difficult, it was an extremely unpredictable situation, and nobody recognized that Kabul would fall so quickly. And there are so many lessons to be learned, and indeed, after every operation, the Canadian Armed Forces takes care to evaluate lessons to be learned.
An election, a lesson learned?
This was a time that I was not in the role as minister. So, of course, I had just, as you know so well, been procuring vaccines for the country. But I will turn to my deputy minister.
Okay. Thank you. I'll ask a question broadly. Are you aware of anyone in your department or in the previous minister's office that delegated authority to any parliamentarians on behalf of your department or any other government agency to issue visa facilitation letters?
I am not aware, no, of any such activity.
Would anyone in the minister's office have the authority to be able to delegate that authority to a parliamentarian?
I do not believe so. The facilitation letters were only issued by GAC and by IRCC using official government email addresses sent directly to applicants, and there's, as you know, an ongoing investigation, but my office and I have no special knowledge of this.
Thank you. The last time you appeared on this issue, I think it was several months ago at the special committee, There were still, by all accounts, several thousand Afghans with bona fide connections to having served with our country's efforts in Afghanistan that had not been evacuated. I reviewed the federal budget yesterday. Why wasn't there significant additional funding for the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly given that there was clearly a capacity gap in this area?
So the last time I appeared at this committee, we did discuss the goal of IRCC and our government to bring at least 40,000 vulnerable Afghans to Canada. We have now made progress, even more progress towards that goal, with 28,000 Afghans that Canada can now call home. And this progress is going well. It's an ambitious target. It is one that we take very seriously and will bring as many Afghans to Canada as quickly and safely as possible. This remains our priority.
How many of those persons did we have to rely on other nations or allied nations to evacuate for us?
The evacuation, as I said, was very tense. It was moving very quickly. We worked very hard to secure the air bridge and to bring out as many Afghans as possible.
How come, thank you. Again, the federal budget, given the geopolitical situation, it has a glaring omission in terms of any sort of significant increase in funding to address our capacity gap. Why weren't you able to secure that funding with your cabinet colleagues for our armed forces, particularly given the outcome of this report? It's clear that we need more resources. Why isn't that in there?
Well, I'd like to take you to the fact that we put on the table almost $40 billion for NORAD modernization and continental defense last June, in addition to $8 billion in the budget of 2022, in addition to a 70% increase in defense spending beginning in 2017 under Strong, Secure, Engaged, and the fact that we are undertaking
sorry for interrupting.
A defense policy update, and we will.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up. We will now proceed to Mr. Al-Khouri. Mr. Al-Khouri, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome to our committee, Madam Minister, and thank you for all of the work that you do. It is quite remarkable. My first question is as follows. As you know, the situation in Afghanistan is complex. Why? Because there can't be peacekeeping missions, as was the case in Syria in 2014 with the UN. Can you tell us more? And specifically, what the impacts are for your department?
Merci pour.
Thank you for the question. It's important to examine our missions and our operations. As I stated in English, the situation was very difficult during the summer of 2021. We now have an ambitious goal, and have worked hard to achieve it. We want to resettle 40,000 Afghans in Canada as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. Those are our priorities. That was the case for all of our operations. But regardless of the country where there are operations, we have to wonder what we can do in a given situation. And perhaps I will give the floor to the Chief of the Defense Staff for further comments.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you very much, Madam Minister. Madam Chair, perhaps I could add a few things with peacekeeping missions in Afghanistan. The situation in Afghanistan is too complex for a traditional mission. For such a mission, we need the approval on all sides. I was in deployment in Afghanistan, and it was not possible to have a traditional peacekeeping mission there. I have a question for General Isle. As Chief of the Defense Staff in 2021, you are well placed to tell us about the events that led to the fall of Kabul, of air operations, and the expertise of Canadian Armed Forces members in the field. Can you give us an idea of what happened? What were the difficulties? What did you learn as Chief of Defense Staff there?
Madame la Présidente, j'étais ici.
Madam Chair, I was here at this committee on May 9th, 2022. And during that committee, I spoke of my pride in our staff. I will continue in English with technical terms.
From our perspective, we did not have a sizable military, we didn't have any military force on the ground since 2014 when we withdrew out of Afghanistan. In fact, I was at ISAF headquarters in Kabul when we lowered the flag. And so for a period of 7 years, we had no sizable military presence there. And our ability to project force across the globe into a highly contested environment with our air capabilities, with our special operations capabilities, with a global signals capability, and extract as many Afghans as we did speaks to the ability, the passion, the proficiency of our members. And Madam Chair, I'm very, very proud of what our members accomplished in some extremely difficult conditions. And we've learned and we've continued to apply the lessons over the last number of years.
Madame la Ministre.
Madam Minister, in this report, we often see recommendations for special emergency measures in the different departments that focus on this crisis. There was mention of creating an emergency unit. And what do you think of these recommendations?
You will get an opportunity in the second round. So with that, we will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desaep for 6 minutes. Mr. Brunel Desaep, you can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Madam Minister, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us, and thank you for your service. Thank you for taking the time to come to our committee. It is greatly appreciated. You talked about Recommendation 18, creating the Special Committee on Afghanistan was a conservative idea, but the Bloc came forward with an amendment to the motion to create the committee with the Conservatives' agreement. And we asked to have recommendations on what could be done as the committee was sitting and what could be done in the future so that we could assist Afghans and so that we could react more quickly if such a crisis were to occur again. So Recommendation 18 mentioned the creation of a team, an intergovernmental team. How are your discussions going on that front?
Merci pour.
Thank you for the question. We are working closely with our government partners in order to continue to learn from this crisis and other crises. That's what our government does every time. That's what we've done in Ukraine and Haiti and Afghanistan. We want to share lessons learned. Every recommendation made by that committee is important for us because the work of that committee was important. We continue to work closely with our partners in government in order to learn from what has happened and to improve our approach. You worked with IRCC. There was a proposal by the bloc before even the recommendations were shared. We had proposed the creation within IRCC a permanent emergency mechanism if there's an environmental catastrophe or if there was any other crisis, for example, the fall of Kabul. And we've learned that IRCC has asked its public servants to examine that possibility. And because it impacts you, when you need to help people leave a country, you need to work with IRCC to let them come into the country. Do you believe that things take too long? Do you believe that this mechanism will be able to be put in place quickly?
Merci pour cette.
Thank you for the question again. We continue to support the work of our partners like IRCC. If they decide to have a similar committee for another crisis, we will continue to support their work. I don't know if our department was able to have discussions on that specific recommendation, but I could ask the Deputy Minister to respond. Thank you, Madam Minister, and thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, there are discussions ongoing, but the biggest challenges in the world impact many departments. So interdepartmental work is important, but we need a department, of course, to be at the head of all these affairs. But in this case, it's global affairs, but work is continuing. General Prévost might have something to add on his work, but it depends on how much time is left. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Minister and Madam Chair. We're not aware of progress at IRCC, but we speak daily, weekly for Afghanistan. The interdepartmental framework is having communications, and I had a discussion even yesterday with counterparts. After the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, different departments worked together. The minister approved a deployment of members in Poland in order to assist with the refugees that were fleeing. Thank you. I don't have a lot of time, and I have an important question to ask you on C41. The Minister of Justice was just here to speak to us, and he was not able to explain why it had taken so long, even though the solution existed. He stated there were a lot of discussions behind closed doors, but he could not break cabinet confidence. Were you a part of these discussions? I'm not asking you to share what was said, but just were you a part of these discussions? As I stated, during that time, I was the Minister of PSPC, and so no, I was not part of those discussions. If I can finish my sentence, I was not a part of the discussions at that time.
Up for Mr. Brunel Desep. We will now proceed to Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 6 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Minister and the officials for being here today. I'd like to get a little bit into about D&D referrals, and so that would be specifically individuals who are, for example, interpreters for the Department of National Defence or served Canada in some way. Could the Minister advise how were D&D referrals made, and how were these referrals vetted?
So, Defense serves as a validating partner to support IRCC's policies, and including its new policy to facilitate the reunification of former advisors who works with the defense team and members of their families. So it is a supporting role that we play as a validating partner.
D&D makes referrals, though, for IRCC's consideration. How did you determine who you would make those referrals for?
Let me ask the Chief of Defense Staff to pick up where I left off.
So, Madam Chair, we stood up a team in our Strategic Joint Staff under General Prévost to help process all of these files, and from there we were able to determine or validate the files and then make a referral from that perspective. For the exact details, I will turn over to General Prévost to elaborate.
Thank you, Chief and Madam Chair, and thank you for the member's question. So the referrals, the files that DND and CAF and my team vet for IRCC are files where applicants apply to the CIMS program. We didn't refer on our own as a department files to IRCC, but rather we just make sure that the files that are submitted to the immigration have a significant nexus to CAF, members that have served in Afghanistan with us. So we have to establish that link, and the way we do this is by looking at the referral. Sometimes the national Afghan, the Afghan national will submit names of who he worked for. We contact those individuals. We look at contracts we had with all the Afghans. So we go through a whole bunch of database to make sure that there was a significant relationship with the CAF, after which we validate that and provide the answer to the Minister of Immigration.
So given the period in which Canada had armed forces and had personnel in Afghanistan doing a variety of different tasks in support of Canada, in service of Canada, and because these contracts are signed by your department, and individuals are put on onto these various contracts. So you have a record of all of that. So you would then, in your system, have a record of how many people actually served Canada in different capacities, do you not?
So, of course, we are continuing to support IRCC in this process, but it is primarily run out of IRCC. So in terms of numbers and past files, et cetera, those numbers would need to be gleaned
Thank you,
from
Minister.
IRCC.
I appreciate that work is being done by RCC. What I'm trying to get at, though, is the number of how many Afghans actually worked for Canada and under your department, under the Department of National Defence, and both by contract, and some of them are interpreters, some of them actually worked as security guards or in other capacities. So is there a figure to which the department can provide to the committee how many Afghans served Canada during that period?
I personally do not have that number with me. I will ask the Chief of Defence Staff to indicate whether record keeping occurred and the quality of that record keeping.
So, Madam Chair, I will try to add some context to the question. It's a very complex situation. I'll use my own experience there.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt for a second. I actually don't have a lot of time because I'll get cut off momentarily. I just need to know whether or not can we get at this number and whether or not it's as fulsome as it could be, as best as you can. Could you provide committee with a number?
Madam Chair, given that some of the Afghans who were working with us were actually contracted through other nations or organizations, settling on a final number, in my view, is probably impossible.
So does D&D not have the records of the contracts that you've signed?
So, you want to add on?
Yeah, Madam Chair. So we don't have the amount of. We'll look if we can provide a number, but like the chief explained as well, some of those people were never under contract with anybody, but had a significant relationship with the CAF, and this is part of the verification we do as well.
So maybe for the ones that did have a contract with D&D, maybe we can provide with that number, and then what capacity in general categories. That would be a good place to start. There are many others who are subcontracted who are not counted, that's for sure. Daily I receive emails. Just yesterday, I hardly knew what to do. I received an email from a former interpreter of the Canadian Armed Forces who applied back on August 26, 2021. And their application went nowhere, was never vetted. They have sent me contracts and all that kind of stuff, and pictures of their family being beaten by the Taliban. I don't know what to do. I honestly don't know, and I don't know how it is that Canada have contracts with these individuals who served Canada, and we don't know who they are, we don't know where they are, or how many there are.
Sorry for interrupting, Ms. Kwan. Your time is up. Thank you. We will now proceed to Mr. Bizan. Mr. Bizan, you will have 5 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the Minister for being here, along with members of the defense team. I just want to thank those that serve in the Canadian Armed Forces for the work they did in getting out what they were able to do. I can only describe what happened there as chaotic, dangerous, precarious. It was unbelievable watching it on TV. So being on the ground and having to deal with it, make sure that all those that served over there and helped those Afghans get out, you share our gratitude. To follow up on Ms. Kwan, what she was just saying, both Deputy Minister Matthews and General Eyre appeared before the Special Afghanistan Committee. You said at that point in time, back on May 9th, that 7,500 Afghans had contacted the Department of National Defense, had said that they were either interpreters or had been locally engaged staff, and of that, 3,800 made the cut. So what's changed in a year that you don't have a number?
I'll start. Yeah. The number that we have approximately is 3,700 actually evacuated. And we had 555 Canadian Armed Forces members across the board supporting this. And we were dealing with a very tense situation on the ground, but the Canadian Armed Forces, and I'll let General Eyre speak to this, remain nimble on the ground, even though the situation at the airport was extremely difficult. So
where are we at? I know at one point in time we're talking 900 interpreters. These are people that served alongside our forces that made sure they were aware of the dangers around them and stood shoulder to shoulder with our soldiers. So where are they? Are they getting here? Like, you vetted them? Is IRCC inviting them? Like, where are we at?
Madam Chair. So the numbers have evolved since 9th of May 22. I'll turn it over to General Prevost for the details.
Thank you, Chief. Madam Chair, so on the numbers of files that we've confirmed, that we've established a link with the CAF, we have vetted 4,500 files, nearly 4,500, 4,498 to be exact. So we've established a direct link. I cannot provide the member with how many of them are interpreters or contractors of any, but we've established that link for 4,500. Of those files, because the program at 18,000 now is nearly full, we are ready to submit files as IRCC is asking for those files. Right now, we've submitted 1,850 files for IRCC to invite Afghans. Obviously, you have to multiply by the number of family members, but now we're nearly close to the significant to the 18,000 Afghans to be called. Even this morning, I provided an extra 160 files to IRCC so they can maximize the room left in the 18,000
So you're couching this by saying that there's definitely a limit that we're hitting here. Why would we leave anyone behind that served with our forces, that tried to make a difference, and now are enemies of the Taliban, enemies of the state in Afghanistan? Why would we leave any of them behind? We have the Special Immigration Measures Program that are supposed to be priority. I think all Canadians understand that they're supposed to be a priority. So why aren't they coming?
I'll say that there is every effort being made to continue to evacuate, as IRCC has said, 40,000 Afghan nationals, and that will include the reunification of former advisors who worked with national defense in Afghanistan with members of their extended family who are outside of Canada. And as I said, national defense is validating applications when and as requested by our IRCC, and we are doing whatever we can to facilitate the evacuation.
Minister Anand, have you been having conversations with Minister Fraser at immigration to ensure that he is going to prioritize those that served with our veterans, those that served with our current serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces?
We are continuing to advocate for a coordinated effort by the international community and including in the Government of Canada to support all those who advised the D&D CAF, but also to ensure that families are reunited. There are a number of families that need to continue to be reunited, and that's really our
And that's
focus.
what a lot of the families here want. The families that did get out early on the first special immigration program that came, in 2013, 2014, 2015, they're trying to reunite with their families. A lot of those families were also, locally engaged staff or were interpreters. And they can't get out of Afghanistan. So the question is, are we going to let immigration do what is easy? Or are we going to actually do the hard work to get those that did the hard work for us?
Sorry for interrupting. You will get time in the second round. Time is up. We will now proceed to Mr. Dhaliwal. Mr. Dhaliwal, you will have 5 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the Honourable Minister, her Deputy Minister, Chief of Defence Staff, and Director of Staff for being with us today. Minister Anand, as your name Anand says, bliss and happiness, it's always blissful and happy to work with you on compassionate issues such as Afghanistan, that you not only work very hard, but work very passionately to address those issues. On this one, Minister, you appeared on a special committee on Afghanistan, and during your appearance, you spoke about the effects of Canadian Armed Forces being pulled out of Afghanistan in 2014 and the impacts it had on the evacuation in 2021. You mentioned that with all things considered, we worked with our allies very efficiently, although we did not quite have the same type of presence on the ground as some of our allies. Could you please speak about the operation and threats to our personnel and assets on the ground and how the armed forces were able to move efficiently with all things considered?
For the words at the opening of your question. Canada had no military assets on the ground at the outset, nor did it have access to a secure alternative site on the military side of the airport in Kabul as other NATO allies did. That has to be remembered. And the effective operation of our personnel comes down to their professionalism. It comes down to their expertise. It comes down to the high level of preparation that they were able to exhibit through exercises, through training, through rigorous planning that goes into an operation like this one. And moreover, I would say this speaks to the strength of our alliance and the strong level of coordination among NATO allies writ large. We train with our allies regularly. We have personnel embedded with our allies, and they have personnel embedded with the Canadian Armed Forces. All of this means that the Canadian Armed Forces can not only operate effectively as a team, but they can also operate in a highly coordinated manner with our NATO allies in the most strenuous and the most dangerous of circumstances. And I will ask the Chief of Defence Staff if he would like to speak to the particularities of this effort with our allies.
Madam Chair, I will just add one point, and that's the importance of the global network of exchange positions, liaison positions that we have that greatly facilitated this operation. So let me give you a few examples. One, the U.S. headquarters that was overseeing this was their central command. We had a general officer who was the deputy director of operations in that headquarters. Great access. In the Middle East, the Coalition Air Operations Center, we had a general officer who was one of the senior members in that position, and General Prevost here actually did that position several years ago, and he can speak to details about the coordination of the airflow that was so important. Our Joint Task Force Impact that's located in Kuwait. Having the base in Kuwait provided us a footprint on the ground, a place to be able to move Afghan refugees into, and knowing the size of that camp and just it was busting at the seams when we moved way more Afghans in there than what it had capacity for. The relationships that we have with various allies, conventional and special operations forces, that greatly facilitated the work on the ground. Personal relationships matter. They are they take away a lot of friction that is otherwise inherent in coalition operations. And so that, Madam Chair, from my perspective, is one of the very important lessons that we take away from this that needs to be sustained.
Minister, many of my constituents, and during the Special Committee on Afghanistan, there were some suggestions that Canada is treating Afghan refugees and Ukraine refugees very differently. Could you please speak to those differences from an operational perspective that dealing with these two situations?
Well, thank you for the question. I'd like to start by saying that in both situations, we have seen tremendous compassion and generosity from Canadians in welcoming refugees from Afghanistan and Ukraine alike. And these are individuals and families who are fleeing unimaginable circumstances and hardship, and Canadians have always welcomed and supported them. And this is something that we see time and time again in this country, and it is inspiring to see and to know that Canadians will always step up when people are suffering. As for your question, you're exactly right. These are different
Sorry for
situations.
interrupting, Minister. Time is up for Mr. Dhaliwal. We will now proceed. We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Dessep for 2.5 minutes. Mr. Brunel Dessep.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the last question that I asked, you said that you weren't yet Minister of Defense, but I think we misunderstood each other. Okay, because you were nominated in 2021, and we started talking about humanitarian aid in February. So I imagine that you were a part of discussions with different departments, so you were aware of the issues faced by NGOs who couldn't do their work on the field. Were you aware of the situation?
Oui, bien.
Yes. And we heard that there were a lot of discussions between the different departments. It took over a year, 15 months, after the resolution adopted by the UN in December 2021, asking countries to modify their criminal codes so that their humanitarian organizations could do their work. NGOs in Canada know the field, and they couldn't work because of the criminal code. It took 15 months. The solution has existed from the beginning. And what I'm hearing is that the government cannot tell me why it took so much time. The Bloc will support these efforts and will bring amendments so that it can be adopted quickly. But is there somebody in the government who can explain to me why it took so long when the solution was there and nothing has changed since the solution was shown? Thank you for the question. And now I understand your question. I want to say that my colleagues worked very hard in order to strike a balance between two things. Firstly, offering humanitarian aid. I'm sorry, Madam Minister, I have to interrupt you. I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to know about the balance. I know the bill. I want to know why it took so long. That's the only question that I have, and nobody's been able to answer it. I want to know, and people want to know, community organizations want to know why it took so long. Afghans in Afghanistan want to know why the federal government took so long. That's the only answer that I want to hear. I understand your question, and as I said, my colleagues worked very hard in order to find a balance between two things. Firstly, how to offer humanitarian aid and how we could respect anti-terrorist legislation.
Proceed to Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes. Ms. Kwan.
According to an ATIP that I've got, between August 2021 to June 2022, 9,512 D&D applications were received. So on the basis of that, what we just heard is that 4,498 files is now being processed. So that's about half of the applications that's been received or confirmed, I guess, by D&D. And now we're reaching that 18,000 number. We're nearing the end of it. So that means there's no more room to add more people where half of the files have not yet been processed. And so on this basis, you know, we understand that these individuals are people who served Canada, put their lives at risk, put their loved ones' lives at risk, being hunted down right now. Does it make sense to the minister that the government has put a cap, an arbitrary cap on it, this 18,000? Where did this 18,000 cap come from? And does that reflect the actual number of people who actually served Canada?
I look at the 40,000 number, which is the overall number of vulnerable Afghans that we want
Sorry,
to
I'm going to be
bring
very
to
specific.
Canada.
Minister, I'm going to interrupt for a second. I'm going to be very specific. I'm now going to be talking about specifically for people who served Canada, and in this instance, who served D&D. And we're talking about them and not other categories.
Okay, I understand. So what our role is in this process is to support IRCC. IRCC comes forward with, for example, the Special Immigration Measures Program for Afghan nationals and their families who assisted the Government of Canada. And what DND does is to support them in the execution of that program.
Thank
where
you,
possible.
Minister. I appreciate that. But as the minister, these are people who served served Canada.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, they are extended family members of Canada's military. Do you not think that Canada should extend that 18,000 and bring all of the people who are at risk to Canada? Until that's done, our job is not done. Would the minister agree with that?
We are working really hard to reach this ambitious target. We've made significant progress on meeting it, and reaching the goal is going to be the top priority to do so quickly.
Thank you, Minister.
And safely.
But the 18,000 number is already up. You have already reached that goal. Yes, we need to bring them there. But for all those who's been left behind, at least half of the applications have not even been processed. And that's not accounting the people who never got the referral. Madam
Ms. Kwan, your time is up.
Minister.
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. We will now proceed to Mr. Bizayan for 5 minutes. You can
Chair,
please begin.
and just want to pick up where I left off. We're talking about the most vulnerable and targeted Afghans who were left behind, those that served with the Canadian Armed Forces. They empowered us, they enabled us, they kept us safe. They worked with our provincial reconstruction teams. and they were more than just, local contractors. They became part of family. And our veterans and those that are currently serving care deeply about them. Now, we know that you're coming up on the 18,000 limit. We know that the goal is to get to 40,000, and there's a lot of easy Afghans to reach as refugees who are already out of harm's way. I think what Canadians want to know, what members of the armed forces want to know, and what our veterans want to know who served alongside them and often are suffering greatly but because they're still in contact with them, when are we going to invite the rest of those that have been vetted and accepted to join us here in Canada?
So I'll begin by saying thank you for the question. Our 40,000 number is one of the highest per capita targets.
That's fine,
in
and
the
I think that's
world,
great, Minister.
And we are focused on vulnerable Afghans. We are focused on doing this evacuation and continue bringing through Afghan nationals as quickly as possible. It is a priority for IRCC, and DND is assisting wherever and however possible.
We know for a fact that those that served with our forces, and even we talked about the language and culture advisors, which were Canadian Afghans who went back. There's over 40 of them. They got, over 1,000 family members back there that will also want to come. We know that they're being targeted, along with those that are interpreters in their family, by the Taliban. They're being arrested, interrogated, tortured, and executed. Are we going to protect those people? Are we going to make sure that they get a chance to come to Canada and be safe?
Well, the scenario that you are pointing to is deeply disconcerting, and we are working to support IRCC's policy to facilitate reunification of former advisors and vulnerable Afghans and members of their extended family, in fact. We are validating applications when and as requested by IRCC, and IRCC is really best placed to speak to the specific.
So are you advocating for those Afghans to Minister Fraser, saying these should be our priority? Let's help get them out. Let's give them the advice on how do they get to safe haven so that they can be brought here as refugees. Because I know our offices, including my own, one of my staffs, their cell number's gone all through Afghanistan. We're getting calls all the time. We don't have the resources to vet. And we rely heavily on the list that has come from the Department of National Defense. So will you make sure that those people are the target audience that we're trying to rescue, rather than going after the ones that have already reached safe refuge?
We are all in agreement that we need to continue to support vulnerable Afghans in getting to Canada as safely and as quickly as possible. And we, as a government, are continuing to explore additional avenues to bring more Afghans to safety as quickly and as safely as possible.
So General Prevost just said in the last round that over 1,850 people that were vetted by National Defense have been provided to IRCC. Do you know if IRCC is going to provide an invitation for them to come to Canada, including those that were at Graceland?
Let me ask General Prevost if he would like to add anything here.
Thank you, Minister, Madam Chair. So to answer the member, these 1,840 files that were provided to IRCC are the files for which IRCC has extended an offer for application. As more space becomes available, we continue to push files that we have vetted within the department, and IRCC continues to look at how we can bring more vulnerable Afghan. The language and cultural advisor file.
Do you feel confident that the Department of Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada will extend the invitation to those vulnerable Afghans who are coming through the special immigration program?
Madam Chair, I'm very confident. Like I mentioned before, just this morning again, we pushed another 160 files we had vetted for IRCC that they in turn are pushing.
So Minister Anand, has Minister Fraser given you assurances that those invitations will be issued?
As I said, we're working as a government here, and it is our government's policy
I don't like the
to
obfuscation
support
here.
vulnerable Afghans in getting to Canada as safely as possible. It is a priority for us, and we're working very hard to get to the targets that we have set.
Thank you. We will now end this panel with Ms. Lalonde for 5 minutes. Ms. Lalonde, you can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I have the privilege of actually having the last 5 minutes, so I will take them to say thank you, Minister, for being here, but I also would like to recognize and thank the men and women who served during the Afghanistan war. I also want to recognize all the hard work that was presented to everyone who was involved during the extraction. And I certainly want to say thank you for the work that you do every single day to protect our great nation. So that's, I want to make sure, and I know, Minister, I'm speaking a little bit on the right side from my view here, but thank you for everything that you are all doing. You know, I think we went through many questions, and maybe, Minister, I would like you to share with us you know, sort of the next phase and where we're at, and maybe explain to this committee as we move forward more about, you know, the importance of those recommendations and why we're having this conversation today, but also what's next. And what I hear is a great desire to continue to contribute. So maybe Minister and everyone here. Merci.
Okay, merci pour cette question. C'est très...
Thank you for the question. It's very important. I would like to start by saying that there are lessons to be learned for everyone. I would like to know what you think of the recommendations.
Number one, of course, we always want to learn from the past and apply greater knowledge to future crises, recognizing that there is no one-size-fits-all solution to every crisis. The Canadian Armed Forces conduct lessons learned exercises after every operation, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Haiti, whether it's Afghanistan, etc. And there is no exception here. But of course, with the work that your committee is doing, it's extremely important for us to take that into account also. So I will be encouraging my department and the Canadian Armed Forces to make sure that we are hearing the words in your report. And then on recommendation number 2, whole of government cooperation is what we do. We are always working together across departments, whether it is Hurricane Fiona here in Canada or whether it is an international operation, including Operation Aegis. And then finally, as I've said a number of times, bringing Afghans to safety, recommendation 18, we will continue to work and support IRCC in reaching the 40,000 number. And this work is difficult, it's ongoing, but again, I look forward to the words that your committee says, parce que c'est important pour nous.
Because it's important for us to continue to listen and see what we can do in the future and now as well.
Oh, thank you, Minister and Madam Chair. Maybe I'll just add, in conclusion, just some context. And so I think the fall of Afghanistan, indeed our own involvement in Afghanistan, and then the subsequent fall 7 years after we left, just shows how dangerous the world is becoming. Between what we see the Taliban doing, what we see the Russians doing in Ukraine, we can see that civilization is just a thin veneer that is very easily ripped off. And the Canadian Armed Forces, your Canadian Armed Forces, have been involved around the world in many places. And the world is only getting much more dangerous. And so we have to be ready, and we have to learn and pull the lessons, because we'll be using them in the future. Your Canadian Armed Forces needs to be ready. And so as our elected parliamentarians, I would ask all of you to go to your constituents and convince them to join our ranks, because this is a great institution. It's filled with great people, and they're here to serve you and the people of Canada.
I don't know if I really want to give you the floor. I think it's important that we hear from you.
I might just add, Madam Chair, that when we talk about intergovernmental cooperation, we should remember that military capabilities are only one tool in the overall toolbox, and we need to continue to build on the experience with our governmental counterparts in different departments, which is exactly what we're doing. In terms of Canadian Armed Forces lessons learned, these include non-combatant evacuation operations, and in March 2023, the Canadian Armed Forces actually is participating in an exercise called Noah's Ark in Israel to practice interoperability between allies and partners for the conduct of a NEO in this region. And I'll just say that speaks to the fact that the lessons learned continues for the Canadian Armed Forces. Having said that, as I said, the lessons learned from this committee are also very important.
Thank you. With this panel comes to an end. And on behalf of all the members of this committee, I really want to thank you, Minister, for appearing before the committee, and thank you for all the work which you do on behalf of the Canadians. With that, the meeting is adjourned.